Hey everyone, and a massive welcome to the channel. Before we dive deep into one of history's most epic sagas, I genuinely hope you're feeling fantastic today, sending positive vibes and wishing you nothing but great health and energy. Seriously, take care of yourselves. Now, have you ever stopped to think about how much of our everyday world, from the languages we speak, the laws we follow, even the concrete under our feet, owes a huge debt to a single, ancient powerhouse? That's right, we're talking about the colossal story of Rome. Picture this, a tiny village of shepherds huddled on some hills in Italy, barely a blip on the map, somehow transforming itself over centuries into a sprawling, world-dominating empire that stretched from the rainy highlands of Scotland all the way to the scorching deserts of Egypt. How on earth did they pull that off? And then, perhaps even more mind-bogglingly, how did this seemingly invincible giant, this engine of civilization that lasted over 1,000 years, finally crumble and collapse into dust and memory? Buckle up, because we're about to embark on an incredible journey through the breathtaking rise and the dramatic, heartbreaking fall of the Roman Empire. It's a tale packed with brilliant engineering, fierce battles, cunning politics, legendary figures, and ultimately, lessons that still echo loudly in our own world today. Get comfy, this is going to be a ride. Imagine a small cluster of huts perched on hills overlooking the Tiber River in central Italy, maybe around 753 BC. That's the humble, almost mythical, beginning of Rome. Forget instant glory, these early Romans were tough, practical farmers and fighters, constantly scrapping with their neighbors. Their secret weapon wasn't magic or divine favor, though they believed in plenty of gods. It was an incredibly adaptable and resilient society. Think of them like a determined startup. They learned from everyone around them, especially the sophisticated Etruscans to the north and the Greek colonists to the south. They borrowed ideas about building, religion, even the alphabet, but then made it distinctly Roman. Their real genius kicked in with their government. Fed up with kings, they threw them out around 509 BC and set up a republic, residential publica, meaning the public affair. This wasn't a democracy like ancient Athens where every citizen voted on everything directly. Instead, it was a complex, often messy, system of elected officials, like consuls, the top bosses, a powerful senate, full of wealthy elders and experienced leaders, and assemblies where regular citizens could have a voice, albeit a limited one. The key was balance, or at least, the attempt at balance, to stop any one person from grabbing too much power. This republican spirit, this idea of shared governance and civic duty, became the engine room of Rome's early expansion. But ambition is a powerful fuel. Driven by a potent mix of perceived threats, a desire for security, and plain old-fashioned greed for land and wealth, the Roman Republic began flexing its muscles across Italy. This wasn't always smooth sailing. They faced devastating defeats, like the sack of Rome itself by Gallic tribes around 390 BC, a massive shock that made them double down on military strength. And double down they did. The Roman army became legendary, a terrifyingly efficient machine. Forget heroic individual warriors, this was about disciplined units, standardized equipment, brilliant engineering for camps and siege warfare, and an almost insane level of organization and training. Legionaries, the backbone of the army, were citizen soldiers, expected to serve when called. They marched in perfect formation behind their heavy shields, relentlessly advancing, throwing javelins, pylons. Designed to bend and stick in enemy shields, before closing in with their short, stabbing swords, gladii. This machine systematically conquered the Italian peninsula, not just by brute force, but often by cleverly offering defeated peoples a path to becoming Roman allies or even full citizens later. It was the beginning of their unique talent for assimilation. Conquering Italy was just the warm-up act. Soon, Rome's gaze turned across the Mediterranean, and that meant inevitable, earth-shaking clashes with other major powers. The first epic showdown was with Carthage, a wealthy, maritime empire based in North Africa, modern-day Tunisia. This rivalry exploded into the three brutal Punic Wars, spanning over a century. The first war was largely a naval struggle over Sicily. The second war featured the legendary Carthaginian general Hannibal, who pulled off the almost impossible, marching his army, complete with war elephants, across the Alps into Italy itself. For over a decade, Hannibal ran rings around larger Roman armies, inflicting catastrophic defeats like Cannae. Rome was brought to its knees, its very survival hanging by a thread. Yet, that Roman resilience kicked in again. They refused to surrender, adopted a strategy of avoiding direct confrontation with Hannibal in Italy while attacking Carthaginian interests elsewhere, and finally produced a general of their own caliber, Scipio Africanus. Scipio took the fight to Africa, defeating Hannibal decisively at Zama in 202 BC. Carthage was broken, stripped of its empire and fleet. The Third Punic War decades later was essentially a brutal mop-up operation, ending with the utter destruction of Carthage itself. The city was razed, the ground sown with salt. Rome was now the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Victory over Carthage unleashed a tidal wave of wealth, slaves, and new territories into Rome. But this sudden influx of riches, while making the empire vastly richer and more powerful on the global stage, started to crack the foundations of the republic back home. Imagine a small-town government suddenly trying to run a massive multinational corporation. The old systems began to creak and strain under the pressure. A massive gap opened up between the super-rich elite, the senators and wealthy landowners, and everyone else. Small farmers, the backbone of the old citizen-soldier army, found their lands ruined by years of war or bought up cheaply by wealthy aristocrats creating vast slave-run estates, latifundia. These displaced farmers flooded into Rome, becoming a restless, unemployed urban poor. Meanwhile, the influx of slaves from conquered territories depressed wages for free workers. Corruption became rampant as politicians and businessmen jostled for power and profit from the provinces. The traditional values of duty and simplicity that Romans liked to talk about seemed increasingly like empty slogans. This simmering social and economic pressure cooker was the perfect environment for ambitious individuals to exploit. Enter the era of the warlords. As the Republic's institutions weakened, powerful generals, backed by their loyal, battle-hardened legions, who were increasingly professional soldiers loyal to their commander, not necessarily to Rome itself, began to dominate politics. Figures like Marius, who reformed the army making it more professional but also more loyal to its generals, and Sulla, who marched on Rome itself twice to seize power, shattered old taboos. The rivalry between the populist Julius Caesar and the conservative Pompey the Great exploded into full-scale civil war. Caesar, the brilliant general and charismatic leader, crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BC with his legions, a point of no return, defeated Pompey, and became dictator for life. His assassination in 44 BC by senators hoping to restore the Republic only plunged Rome into another bloody round of civil wars. Out of this chaos emerged Caesar's adopted heir, a young man named Octavian. He proved a master strategist, defeating his rivals Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the last ruler of Hellenistic Egypt, at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Octavian learned from Caesar's fate. Instead of declaring himself king or dictator, he carefully crafted a new system, the Principate. He took the title Augustus, meaning revered one, and became Princeps, first citizen. Officially, he restored the Republic. In reality, he held supreme power as emperor, controlling the army, the treasury, and foreign policy, while letting the Senate keep some ceremonial and administrative functions. The Roman Republic was dead, the Roman Empire was born. Augustus ushered in the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of relative stability, prosperity, and imperial expansion that lasted for about 200 years. The early empire, under Augustus and his successors, the Julio-Claudians like Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, followed by the Flavians like Vespasian and Titus, and then the 5 good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, was Rome at its dazzling, intimidating peak. Imagine an empire stretching over 5 million square kilometers, encircling the Mediterranean, Mare Nostrum, RC. To manage this colossal territory, the Romans built an infrastructure network that was simply mind-blowing for its time. Think of their roads, over 250,000 miles of them. Built with layered foundations and cambered surfaces for drainage, allowing troops, officials, traders, and information to move with astonishing speed. These were the ancient superhighways, connecting Londinium, London, to Alexandria, Carthage to Byzantium. Then there were the aqueducts, soaring stone marvels of engineering that carried fresh water for dozens of miles into cities, supplying public baths, fountains, and private homes. Roman engineering wasn't just functional, it was often beautiful and enduring. Many aqueducts and roads are still standing or in use today. Cities flourished. Rome itself became a metropolis of perhaps 1 million people, packed with monumental architecture, the Colosseum for gladiatorial games and spectacles, the Pantheon with its incredible dome, massive public baths, thermae, serving as community centers, temples, basilicas, used for business and law, and sprawling imperial palaces. Provincial capitals like Ephesus, Alexandria, and Carthage, rebuilt by the Romans, thrived, becoming centers of trade, culture, and Roman administration. Keeping this vast empire together required more than just roads and buildings, it needed systems. The Roman legal system was revolutionary. It developed the idea of natural law, principles of justice believed to be universal. While not perfectly fair by modern standards, slavery was fundamental, women had limited rights. Roman law introduced concepts like the presumption of innocence, the right to a defense, and standardized legal procedures that influenced virtually all Western legal systems. Latin, the language of Rome, became the lingua franca of administration and the educated elite across the Western Empire. Greek dominated the East. Local cultures weren't usually stamped out, instead, there was a process called Romanization. Local elites learned Latin, adopted Roman dress and customs, built Roman-style villas and towns, and participated in Roman government, gradually blending their own traditions with Roman ones. Becoming a Roman citizen was a coveted status, eventually granted to almost all free inhabitants of the empire in 212 AD by Emperor Caracalla. The army, now a fully professional, standing force of around 300,000 men, guarded the frontiers, the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north, Hadrian's Wall in Britain, the deserts of North Africa and the east. These legions weren't just garrisons, they built forts, roads, and towns, becoming engines of Romanization themselves. Trade boomed within this vast, relatively secure space. Grain from Egypt fed Rome, Spanish olive oil filled amphoras shipped everywhere, British tin, Gallic wine, Syrian glass, and spices and silks from the east flowed along the roads and sea lanes, creating immense wealth. The Pax Romana truly was an unprecedented era of connectivity, stability, and cultural exchange across 3 continents. However, even during the height of the Pax Romana, cracks were beginning to show, like hairline fractures in seemingly solid marble. Maintaining such a colossal empire was astronomically expensive. The army swallowed a huge chunk of the budget. Feeding and entertaining the massive population of Rome required constant shipments of grain, the dole, or free grain for citizens, the annona, a massive logistical and financial burden. The sprawling bureaucracy needed to administer the provinces cost money. And then there were the emperors themselves, some of whom engaged in lavish spending on palaces, games, and monuments. Where did the money come from? Primarily taxes squeezed from the provinces and the profits of conquest. But once the era of major expansion stopped, roughly after Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century AD, that easy source of new wealth dried up. Emperors started resorting to debasing the coinage, reducing the precious metal, silver, content in coins while keeping their face value the same. It was like printing money today. It caused inflation, eroding savings, and making everyday goods more expensive, hitting the poor and the middle class hardest. Economic strain became a constant background hum. The 3rd century AD was where the hum became a deafening roar, a period often called the crisis of the 3rd century. It felt like everything that could go wrong, did go wrong, simultaneously and catastrophically. Imagine the empire hit by a perfect storm. Externally, the pressure on the frontiers became immense and constant. In the east, the powerful Persian Sassanid Empire emerged, a far more formidable foe than the earlier Parthians. They inflicted major defeats on Roman armies and even captured Emperor Valerian, who reportedly died in captivity. On the northern frontiers, beyond the Rhine and Danube, Germanic tribes were coalescing into larger, more organized, and aggressive confederations, like the Franks, Alemanni, Goths. Climate changes might have pushed them southwards, seeking better land and wealth inside the empire. These weren't just raids anymore, they were massive invasions. Gothic tribes rampaged through the Balkans, even defeating and killing Emperor Decius in battle. The frontiers, once relatively secure, were breached repeatedly. Internally, the empire imploded. The crisis saw a dizzying parade of emperors, over 20 in just 50 years. Most were generals proclaimed emperor by their own troops, only to be assassinated or defeated in battle by a rival claimant within months or a few years. Civil wars became endemic, bleeding the empire of men, money, and morale. Legions fought each other instead of defending the borders. Plagues, possibly smallpox or measles, swept through the population, weakened by war and economic hardship, killing millions and further crippling the economy and the army's ability to recruit. Inflation went into hyperdrive thanks to continued coin debasement. The silver denarius became virtually worthless. Trade networks broke down. Cities began to decline, their populations shrinking, walls being hastily built for defense as the sense of security vanished. The mighty Roman Empire seemed on the verge of spontaneous combustion. The empire was pulled back from the immediate brink of collapse by a series of tough, reforming emperors, most notably Diocletian, 284 to 305 AD, and Constantine the Great, 306 to 337 AD. They implemented drastic changes to try and stabilize the ship. Diocletian essentially split the empire administratively into eastern and western halves, each with its own senior emperor, Augustus, and junior emperor, Caesar, the Tetrarchy, rule of 4. The idea was to make defense and administration more manageable and ensure smoother succession. He also tried to freeze the crumbling economy with strict price controls, the edict on maximum prices, and tied farmers and workers to their professions to ensure tax revenue and essential services, a move towards a more rigid, less free society. Constantine is famous for two massive things: reuniting the empire, temporarily, and embracing Christianity. He converted after seeing a vision before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, 312 AD. And issued the Edict of Milan, 313 AD, granting tolerance to Christians, ending centuries of sporadic persecution. Christianity's message of hope and community resonated powerfully in the troubled times, and it rapidly gained influence. Constantine also founded a new capital in the east, Constantinople, modern Istanbul, Turkey, strategically positioned on the Bosporus Strait. This new Rome was heavily fortified and became a major center of power and wealth. These reforms bought the empire time, but they also fundamentally changed its character. The state became more autocratic, more bureaucratic, and more heavily taxed. The old civic spirit faded. And the division between East and West, despite Constantine's reunification, became increasingly pronounced. While the reforms staved off total collapse, they couldn't solve the deep-rooted problems permanently, especially in the western half of the empire. The East, centered on Constantinople, was richer, more urbanized, had stronger borders, especially after Constantinople's massive walls were built, and faced generally less pressure until much later. It would evolve into the Byzantine Empire and survive for another 1,000 years. The West, however, was more vulnerable. It faced the brunt of the relentless Germanic migrations and invasions. The Huns, fierce nomadic warriors from the steppes of Central Asia, pushing westward under leaders like Attila, acted like a battering ram, forcing entire tribes like the Goths, Visigoths and Ostrogoths, Vandals, Suebi, and Burgundians to flee into Roman territory seeking safety. Initially, Rome tried to manage this by allowing some groups to settle as allies, foederati, within the empire, promising land and pay in return for military service. But this was a dangerous gamble. These groups often retained their own leaders, laws, and identity, creating semi-independent kingdoms within the empire. Tensions flared over land, resources, and broken promises. The situation deteriorated into open conflict. In 410 AD, a moment that shocked the Roman world, the Visigoths under Alaric sacked the city of Rome itself, the first time the Eternal City had been breached by a foreign enemy in 800 years. It was a massive psychological blow. Then, in 455 AD, the Vandals, who had crossed into North Africa, Rome's vital breadbasket, sailed across the Mediterranean and sacked Rome again, even more brutally. The Western emperors became increasingly powerless figureheads, puppets controlled by powerful Germanic generals like Ricimer, who pulled the strings behind the throne. The Western army itself became largely composed of Germanic foederati, whose loyalty was often questionable. Tax revenue dried up as provinces were lost or overrun, making it impossible to pay the army or maintain infrastructure. Cities shrank further, populations declined, trade dwindled, and literacy plummeted. The complex Roman administrative machinery simply ground to a halt in many areas. By the late 5th century, the Western Empire was a hollow shell. In 476 AD, a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. Instead of declaring himself emperor, Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople, essentially declaring that the West no longer needed its own emperor. He ruled Italy as king. This date, 476 AD, is traditionally marked as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but the final flickering out of a light that had been dimming for centuries. Roman culture and law didn't vanish overnight, but they blended with Germanic traditions in the new kingdoms that arose from the ashes, laying the foundations for medieval Europe. So, why did this incredible empire, this colossus that bestrode the ancient world for so long, finally fall in the West? There's no single villain, no easy answer. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Think of it as a complex system failure. Constant, expensive wars, both defending the vast frontiers and fighting internal civil wars, bled the treasury and the manpower dry. An economy crippled by heavy taxation, rampant inflation from debased coinage, the decline of trade and agriculture, partly due to the disruption caused by invasions and the reliance on slave labor which became less sustainable, and the sheer cost of maintaining the imperial superstructure. Political instability was chronic, especially in the later centuries. Endless coups, assassinations, and civil wars undermined effective leadership and shattered any sense of unity or long-term planning. The sheer size of the empire became unmanageable. Communication and reinforcement across such distances were slow and difficult, making coordinated defense against multiple threats nearly impossible. The failure to fully integrate the large influx of Germanic peoples peacefully led to conflict and the creation of powerful, semi-independent groups within the empire's borders that ultimately helped pull it apart. The split between East and West, while initially a practical move, ultimately meant the richer East focused on its own survival, leaving the West to struggle with less support. Socially, there seemed to be a loss of the old civic virtues and civic participation that fueled the Republic and early empire, a sense of apathy or disconnection set in among the population. The rise of Christianity, while bringing moral strength to many, also shifted focus away from the traditional Roman state religion and civic duties towards the afterlife and the Church, which began to fill the vacuum left by the crumbling state. Finally, the relentless external pressure from well-organized and determined groups like the Germanic tribes and the Sassanid Persians, often exploiting the empire's internal weaknesses, proved overwhelming for the weakened western half. It was the tragic culmination of interconnected problems that built up over centuries, proving that even the mightiest empires are not immune to the forces of decay, change, and the relentless pressure of history. The fall of Rome wasn't just the end of an era, it was a seismic shift that reshaped the world, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape our laws, our languages, our cities, and our understanding of power, ambition, and the fragility of civilization itself. It's a story that reminds us that nothing, no matter how grand, lasts forever, but also that the echoes of greatness can resonate for millennia. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through the rise and fall of the Roman Empire.